Thanks for tuning in to Stay Sharp with Razorleaf, your secret weapon for all things digital and products and manufacturing. In this episode, Jonathan and Jen welcome back Michael Welti from our UK office to delve deeper into the complexities of data migration. They discuss the importance of understanding data mapping, the challenges of transforming data between systems, and the considerations around users and locations during migration. They emphasize understanding data usage in target systems and the challenges of managing historical data. Do you really need it all? They finally highlight the need to address collisions and deduplication when merging data from multiple sources. Let's listen in.
Well, welcome back, everybody, to Stay Sharp, the Razorleaf podcast about all things digital in engineering, manufacturing, and anything product related, really. So we're back today, back with my co-host, Jen Ferrello. Hey, Jen.
Hi, everybody.
And we're back today with a guest that we've had on before, who I'm excited to have back to continue this conversation. So welcome, Michael Welti from Razorleaf.
Hi there. Nice to be back again.
So for those of you that maybe haven't heard Michael before on the podcast and caught an episode there, one of the things that we've talked with him about is migration. And that's what we want to talk about again today. So in a previous episode, we dug into migration and migration processes. What are data migrations about in this space? If you've got a lot of digital data, like we talk about on the podcast, what does a migration entail? What steps do you go through? How do you get it done? That sort of thing. And today we want to dig deeper. I want to talk about some of the things that might not be obvious that people need to know about data migrations of product data, digital product data, and that sort of thing. And it's perfect to have Michael back because if you don't know his background, you can, of course, listen to that in more detail on the other episode on migration. But I'll just tell you, Michael's been working in the PLM space for, I'm going to say 30 years. Is that fair?
20. I'm not that old.
20?
Okay. 20.
All right.
20.
Oh, he's not as old as we
I'm
are.
not
At least
as old.
I am.
I know I'm getting the grey hairs, it's true, but 20 years so far.
So, okay, I make the mistake of associating the gray like is in my beard with, okay, but fair enough. 20-ish years working in the PLM space. And I know just from the work that we've done together, working with multiple different PDM and PLM systems, doing a lot with tools and working with the data and that sort of thing, which is what makes you perfect to have the conversation with us today. So thanks for coming back.
We didn't scare him off, Jonathan.
That's right. I have to say that, right? Because I know, Jen, you and I can be a lot sometimes.
We can.
Well, we can. All right. So let's dive in. I think there's probably a lot of things that we could touch on, but I want to start with something that we talked about in the previous episode when we were talking about process, right? And we talked about things like extraction and transformation and loading. And so I want to dig right into something that's, I think everybody thinks about, but maybe not. When you're thinking about transformation, changing the data from the source system that's coming from into the target it's going into, you have to know how to do that, where it's going to go and that sort of thing. And I think there's a term for this, right? I mean, can you take us through that a little bit? What is that and what does it mean?
So once there's two things you got to know: where you're coming from, the source system, and your target system. And you need to know both of them in quite a lot of detail. So what are the list of, on your source system, what are the list of types and relationships and attributes you're trying to do? And your target system, where exactly you're trying to go to in terms of that target system. And then it's defining the mapping between the two. So a lot of it is kind of more of a mapping exercise.
Yep.
And working out, for instance, where is one particular type of object in your source system going to go to in the target system? How is it going to be represented? Is it a simple one-to-one mapping, as in you're just literally going from this object to become this object, and here are the attribute names, just mapping between attributes? Or is it a much more complicated one? Of is you actually transforming it from, a document here to a more of a digital data type over here? And what has to be changed to meet the kind of target system requirements?
And so I want to back up for a second, Michael, because just to make sure that all our listeners are on the same playing field here, and talk about, all right, type, relationship, attribute. I heard you mention all of those things. So just to give an example for people, give them a concept there. What are each of those? Maybe some simple example.
Some simple. So PLM is all about objects and links. So you have got objects that represent your metadata. So Like, for instance, a CAD assembly could be one type. CAD part could be another type. Both of those types have typically got attributes to represent them. So, like things like the metadata that describes the assembly, like its title, its part number, description, the sort of things that people need to search on to find it, which is what's usually in a PLM platform. Who created it, when it was created. Those are sorts of attribute information. And then you've got the relationships between them. So, for instance, between an assembly and a part, you'd have a relationship to say, this part is inside of this assembly. Okay. And that's the relationships between the two. And it's those things, and it's those kind of, so in PLM, it's all about objects and links and how you move them between systems.
Well, one thing I wanted to point out to our listeners as well, or, that it's not, the reason you have to do the mapping is because the systems are not exactly the same. So the same part, type, object, link, et cetera, like those are not one-to-one match. On occasion, to Michael's point, they are, but there are slight differences or major differences. And I think sometimes you're also trying to not just, and maybe this is getting a little too advanced for this point in the conversation, but sometimes you're trying to add data or enhance the data on the way in as well.
Exactly. And also you might be going from multiple different sources with different representations into one as well. And that's, again, part of that mapping exercise is how you bring it all together. But yeah, so kind of working out, so then it comes down to why you really got to understand the source data, exactly what you've got, and the target system where you're going to, and what the kind of the requirements that target system is going to be, to understand how you can map between the two. And there's quite a lot of information you need to kind of make sure you've got in those mappings as well. So, as I say, the simple ones are kind of between what types it's going to be. So in here, it's going to be an assembly. And in the source system, it's an assembly. In the target system, it's a product. And they've got different lists of attributes, different types of relationships. But essentially, you need to make sure you get all the information across in a way that once it hits the target system, you can use it, and the target system works as it's meant to work, and you've got all the requirements have been met, and you've also got all the attributes that kind of built into it.
Yeah, and you guys just touched on something important there. This can be simple, like the example you just gave, Michael, right? The mapping is sort of one-to-one, and it's a change of a name or something like that, but you understand it. Or it can be quite complex. It could be that you're trying to enhance data or merge two source systems into one target, or make some kind of conditional choice about when it goes to the target. If it's this, I put it here. If it's that, I put it there. So mappings can be quite complex, or they can be quite simple.
They can be quite more often than not, it's complex rather than simple. Unfortunately, the simple one is the least likely one to occur. But yeah, so you've got to go. So a few of these examples, you're almost going from one-to-one, simple mapping, one-to-many, where you're going from one object type to multiple different things. So, for instance, in your source system, you might have an attribute that describes the subtype, as it were, like a document subtype. This one's a specification. This one's a design document. This is a report. In your target system, you might actually have lots of different types to represent those things. So you're going from one possible document type to multiple document types. And then you've also got from many to one, where you've got, and this happens a lot when you've got multiple sources of information you're trying to bring it together. So you might have a PDM system with kind of your drawing files in it. You might have an Access database with your drawing register in it, and somewhere else. And you've got to bring all that information into one to put it into the target system, so that kind of you're merging all the information together from multiple sources. And that can be interesting.
I can see where it's a good idea to call somebody like Michael when you're facing this problem.
so this is what this whole kind of mapping exercise can be quite complex, and some of it. So you need quite a lot. A lot of it comes down to understanding your data of what you've got and where you're going to is quite key. But then working out how to do those mappings and have tools that are capable enough of letting you define those mappings in a way that you can do it at speed and repeatedly between multiple systems. Because obviously we're talking a large volume of data here. It's not something you can just type in every time.
I want to pause real quick and encourage anybody that hasn't listened to the first one, after this conversation, to go back and listen to the first one, or maybe go back and listen to it again, even if you have, because the complexity of this first little piece of mapping really makes it evident why you have to go through the steps that we outlined in the first one.
Yeah. So So in the first one we talked about kind of the traditional one is like extract, transform, load, which is the traditional one. But we're actually putting a few extra stages, which is extract, stage it, and analyze it to really understand it, and then transform and load. That analysis bit is really key because you've got to know exactly what you've got in your source system to then help you drive and work out what your mappings are going to be, which then helps drive your transformations. And that loops through. And so you've got to kind of know what you're going to do. And some of it is down to choice. Some of it's down to requirements. So if you're going to a target system that has got certain requirements that have got to be met, they will almost dictate how that mapping is going to work. Other things which are more kind of business-related information. So a lot of times it's metadata of kind of what's in your target system, where they've had lots of metadata that describes the assembly or product, or whatever it is. Those ones which are more the business values, they're where their kind of customers get to choose a lot more about where that should be mapping to, and they get a bit more involved. So you've got kind of two different levels of mappings, of ones that are mandatory and must happen in a certain way because that meets the requirements of the target system, and some there's a bit more choice involved, and it's more of a business decision about where should these go. Should we keep it? Should we not keep it? Those sorts of decisions come into it.
Well, I'm going to use that as a jumping off point for a couple of things that I think often get overlooked until you get into the meat of the migration, that it's important for people to consider because the ones I'm going to name are the ones that are sort of like the vanilla flavor, like you forget about them because they're so easy. So I want to talk about two: users and locations, right? Those are things that people kind of take for granted in the system, either the source or the target. Are there challenges around those things, and what should people be thinking about there?
So I mean, let's start with users, as it were. So typically, most systems understand kind of who did what, who modified it, who created it, based on the user, as it were. But usually you'll find that the way a source system represents a user is completely different from the way a target system represents a user. But you typically want to kind of maintain information. Who was the creator? Who was the modifier? Right. In a way that both systems recognize it. That means you've got to map, again, as well as mapping kind of the types, attributes, and relationships, you also almost map the users to say, here's our user list in the source system. Here is how they're going to be represented in the target system. Because again, they'll be different. But you need to be able to kind of carry across the concept that John Smith in the source system is John Smith in the target system, and both of them get carried across. So that for the users, you kind of almost got to do that mapping and carry them across. And it also gets tricky where you've got kind of legacy historical users in one system that you don't really want to add to the new system.
That's what I was just going to ask about. Like, what if John's not around anymore?
Yeah.
You know.
That one's a tricky one because it comes down to how important is it to know that he was the person who did a certain task at a certain point in time. Some systems, by adding a user, you consumer license. Some systems you don't. Usually it comes down to the cost implications of adding more user systems. If you can add them as inactive users, essentially, if they're inactive in the source system, again, you want to make them inactive in the target system. But the best is this situation is to bring all of them across. So you can kind of maintain that historical information about who did what when. As long as you can make sure that the users are active, and the users that should be turned off aren't, as it were, and there's no significant cost implication of doing the other one.
Well, there's a couple of other things that make that complex, right? Which is one that I know pops up more these days. That is when the users are sort of kept in the system, but maybe they're using some external directory, right? This is when migrations can get tricky and all the data is not necessarily in the system, but it needs to be a reference. And then the other one you mentioned is order, right? We were talking about mappings a minute ago, and then you mentioned, but you might need to map over the users. Well, I bet if you're going to map a record that says who the owner is, you probably have to have
the users first. So I mean, I think order and precedent of how you do data loading and migration is a whole different topic as well, probably. But essentially, there are certain prerequisites that you need to make sure are in the system. A lot of that's defined by kind of, again, you're right, the users and security and kind of those sorts of details of the system. Before you start loading in the data, the kind of those definition objects of how it defines the users and the security need to be in place before you start loading it in. And also, there's a whole thing around how you can kind of you need to load your objects before your relationships, and you might need to make sure that all of your product information is loaded in before the documents go in, or if you've got systems that can handle loading up at the same time. So order and precedence can be quite a complex thing in migrations as well.
Well, we didn't even touch on that one, but we just touched on it, so I'm glad we did.
So that's with data migrations, order and precedence can, because usually it comes down to speed, as it were. When you're trying to do data migration, you're trying to do it at speed or as fast as possible. That means you tend to try and make it you have multiple parallel streams all running at once.
Right.
If you've got multiple parallel streams all running at once, you've got to make sure that all the requirements, one sort of process is in place before the other one can continue. And so you've got to have systems that can handle kind of ordering the data in the right way, that as relationships try to get connected up. And that's usually where the complexity comes into it. PLM systems are all about objects and links. If you're loading just objects, easy. Loading just links, maybe not. But you've got to make sure that you're getting all of them in place together, so that you can create the right sort of connections.
And you have to be creative too, right? I mean, you have to think about it as, what are my real dependencies versus, well, I thought I should load all the parts first and then the assemblies. Well, that might be right, but challenge yourself, right? It might be, well, I need to get all the record placeholders, but not the attributes, right? Exactly. So maybe I come back and enhance. And so it's not simple, but it's important to remember that. Exactly.
Or you can also kind of work down, you can work also top down and bottom up as well. So in terms of the structures and how you build things up, if you're working with CAD assemblies, you've got to work from kind of bottom up. So you've got to make sure all the base level parts loaded, and then the next level. So you've got to have systems that, as part of that kind of staging, and before you start loading, you've got to know what order am I going to start loading my data in, because you want to try and do it as many parallel streams as possible to increase the speed. Because if you try to do things like, I'm going to load these first, and I'm going to load these and load these, you'll find out that the timeline for your migration process is going to be so long that actually you're not going to be able to hit any targets. So actually you want to say I'm going to start loading everything at once, but in an order that makes sure that as things get built up, everything is in place for the next process to hit it.
Right. That sounds like a challenge. It is a challenge. I know it's a challenge.
It is a challenge. Now, this is why kind of this whole kind of concept of the extract, stage, analyze, comes into key before you start doing transformation and loading, because that kind of helps dictate the order of that process and starts getting you doing those things up front.
Part of what you need to optimize that load, right? Without analyzing it, you can't really optimize it because you don't have enough information to optimize on.
Yeah, exactly.
Makes sense.
Jonathan, you asked about users, and then you asked about locations.
Yeah, location. That's a fun one, right? Because I should put it in air quotes, locations. Yes. What's a location in PLM? I mean, we're not talking about an operating system with folders, are we?
No, exactly. Same sort of concept of all objects and links. It comes down to how you got locations. I mean, you can also think about it in terms of geographic locations as well. That can put some impact on things as well, where things are actually physically located, and how to move them into one system. We've done ones in the past where we're going from kind of multiple sites into one big one,
right?
And then also spinning out. So loading those things. And also it's that traceability as well. You know how you're storing the location now at the moment in your source system, or multiple source systems. As you move to your target platform, as it were, keeping that history of where it came from and what its location was in terms of kind of which site, what security context it's got, can have a big impact on how you do things.
Well, you just touched on like multiple ways that people think of location, right? Like a security context, or a geography, or a business unit orientation, or a project that's associated with, or right? It keeps going.
It keeps going to kind of, I mean, it's like you've done ones. Are you doing a big bang kind of migration? Are you doing it project by project?
Right. Are
you doing it site by site? And again, all those ones done in the past, and each one has got their own kind of complexities. Obviously, if you're doing it kind of project by project, where do you draw the line for the project? Obviously, everything says, here's a project, but as you bury down into it, you find that more and more related information that's spread across the company.
Yeah, turns out that bolt might be used multiple places.
Exactly. So you've got to make sure that as you do it project by project, you're keeping your context and history, so you know that I've already migrated that part as part of that other project. Therefore, I'm going to link it through and make sure that kind of carries through at the same time. And site by site has the same problems, particularly where you've got multiple sites that have been sharing information,
right,
but are storing information in different systems. Mm-hmm. So as you merge from a site-by-site into one, and we do a migration into one platform, as it were, you've got to understand that both sites have probably been kind of using the same kind of CAD models, but they're probably represented or described slightly different in both systems. Which one is the master for it? Which one should you bring across? And how do you reconcile and merge the difference between the two?
So that reminds me of a term that I think is worth mentioning here, right? Which is collisions and deduplication, like that whole concept. I mean, that's a thing that you have to pay attention to, right?
Yeah, and it's particularly if you're going from multiple systems into one.
Yeah,
that whole kind of collisions and detections bit, and also it's not just kind of multiple kind of sources, but if the target system you're going to has been in use for a period of time before you start migrating into it, you've got to be prepared that you're going to essentially potentially get collisions because someone's already manually put the information you're migrating across into that target system.
Like, all of this is making me want to just think, I'm just going to call Razorleaf and have them handle this for me, because this is
and whether it's us or somebody else, right?
Yeah.
It's a good reason to call somebody, right? If you're facing this kind of challenge and saying, okay, I need to move this data across, and I am concerned about not losing it or not mishandling it or whatnot. I mean, that's to me, that's why I wanted for us to have this episode and dig into this conversation. Is if you understand this stuff, then you can at least deal with it or plan for it or ask for some help. But the last thing you want to do is not be aware.
No. Right. And if I'm assuming most companies, this is not something they do. Certainly, you would not want to do this on a, consistent basis. You want to, in most cases, move it once and be done. Not just like, we do this every 6 months. So you're not going to have all of this knowledge and all of the pitfalls. Matter of fact, maybe we should do, after we get done with this one, maybe we should do another podcast just on all the pitfalls and how to avoid them.
I think that's a great idea. Because we were talking about all the things to consider here, but you're right. You could make a list of, what do you not want to do? Right? We should come back to that.
Here's a list of bad ideas. Here's
a list of bad ideas.
I love it.
All right. So getting back to, do we cover locations enough? Jonathan, you had mentioned something earlier about what if somebody is working like in a different database?
Yeah.
Like, was that customer supplier kind of stuff, or?
Well, it could be any number of contexts, right? But I think the thing that I wanted to make sure we're getting on the table about locations is that with a lot of the mapping stuff that Michael brought up at the beginning, there are choices to be made. But locations, in my experience, is the item that is most subjective. People are going to have different opinions, even before migration even gets on the table, right? Multiple people working in one PLM system are going to have different mental models or taxonomies of how they want to organize the data. And so engineering manager A is going to do it one way and engineering manager B is going to do it another way. And at some point, the company's going to set up a standard because they get tired of it. Nobody can find anything. But it comes up in migration all the time. We used to do it this way. What are we going to do next?
I think the biggest one I've seen in the past for that one is folder structures. When you're going from a file system into a PLM system.
Yeah.
Because everyone's used to seeing, I just go to this folder and inside there I'll find my file that I'm looking for, I'll start using it. A lot of PLM systems don't use folder structures. There's no they don't conceptually consist of those folder structures. And in that you typically, with some systems, you just search for things. Other systems, you can kind of create sort of the same sort of representations of folder structures, like workspaces and those sorts of things and bookmarks.
Right.
And it comes down to how do you want to represent, and that's more of, it's a lot, that's less of a migration question. It's more of a business kind of transformation question of how do you want to use that target system? I know we kind of covered this in the previous kind of podcast, but it was about, you're not just doing a data migration, you're also doing kind of a business transformation. How are you going to use and embrace your new target system? And how do you make sure that once you've done the migration, you can use it moving forward?
That actually brings up another great point. So if I think we're good on location, and unless there's anything I missed, Jen, that you're thinking of. What Michael just said is exactly right. Another important part about migration is you can map the data all day and make sure that the data, that was in your source ends up in your target. But you can also sort of do yourself a misservice if you didn't think about how it needs to be used in that target. Like, can you expand on that? Give an example of that, Michael, like why it's not just a data mapping?
So, I mean, think about it, you've got your users are using kind of your legacy source system, as it were.
Yeah.
You're going to migrate them to the new, shiny new target system. That new target system will have its own way of working and different processes and things like that. Not only are you going to have to move and transform the data from the source system to target system, you're moving your users from the source system to target system too. They are going to be the key people that are going to have to use it moving forward. So making sure that you've worked out your business processes in the new system and how you're going to use it while the data migration is going on. So you've got it planned out. So the second that the data is there and ready to go with, they can say, okay, can we start using this now from day one? All those things, like the standard things you've got to take care of an implementation of how we're going to use the system, what are the processes going to be, how are we going to train our users, what are the onboard processes going to be, need to be taken care of as part of data migration. It'd be no good if you kind of do the data migration, go, there's your new system, and everyone sits there and goes, I've got no idea how to use this. What do I do? How do I get my data working? So that sort of kind of the whole business transformation bit needs to be taken care of as well as taking care of the data.
And I think I've seen people make what seem like good, efficient decisions at the time during the migration that years later turn out to not be great decisions related to exactly this topic. And I'll give an example. Okay, I've got a bunch of historical data. I haven't used it for a while. I do need to have that capability that relates to that data in the new system, but the new system deals with the data totally differently. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, going forward, I'm going to use the new system, the new way that the new system does its work, and I'm going to bring over the old data, and it'll kind of be frozen-ish or locked somehow because I don't have quite what I need to make it behave in the new system. And that sounds like a good idea. And I'm not saying it's bad either, right? So just to be clear, I don't mean, one way's good, one way's bad. But the challenge comes in the second time you do that, third time you do that over 10 or 15 years.
Yep.
And now you've got this data set that when somebody does a search in the new system and they find that whatever that data is, they have to think about when it was migrated, when it came across, to know how to deal with it. Oh, that's from the old system that was the blah, blah, blah from when we used blah, blah. And that's, you have to do this with it. And you hold your hand to the left and you face north and then you can access that data and do something with it, right? That's the stuff that you have to think about, to your point. How's it going to get used? Not just, did I get the data?
Exactly. It's the key bit is how I'm going to use it. I mean, to be honest, that whole kind of legacy problem is when you have to deal with it at the migration level as well. As you've got to realize you're not just migrating your current source system, you might be also migrating several other systems that are migrated at the same time. And depending on what decisions they took, if they took that decision to say, we're just going to bring it across as it was and move it across, it then makes it, if it's data you couldn't even use in the source system, migrating that across is going to make it even worse.
Right.
And you get to the point of saying, well, if you can't actually use it in the target system and you can't do it, what is the value of that data? How useful is it? It's a real tricky one. There is that some of it's got to be brought across because of kind of, we just want it for historical reference and compliance.
Right.
With those ones, it's tricky. There's, if you can't actually use it, as in, can you physically open up that legacy data in whatever application you're using if you bring it across in that way? Because you might be able to bring across data, but it might be completely unusable in any system at all. And it comes down to it's quite a tough choice, that one, and how you want to do it.
Right. I mean, it's a great example, right? To your point, it makes me think of CAD versions, old CAD versions, right?
I was just going to ask.
I've brought the data across for 20 years, but guess what? I cannot open CATIA V2. I don't have the computer that will do it. So why am I bringing it across? Or why am I not, to your point, doing something to convert it to, it's now just a historical record? Instead of, I brought the data, I can't do anything with it.
Okay, it's stuck there.
Is that part of a migration process? If you know that, I mean, if you're starting to be concerned, or if you know you won't be able to open that, is there a step where you're talking about CAD models, you translate it to STEP, or you translate it to PDF, something that it's a standard specifically for that, right? Long-term archival and recovery?
What? Yeah.
LOTAR?
Retrieval.
Retrieval.
Yeah, LOTAR. Retrieval. Yeah, LOTAR.
Yeah.
Retrieval. That's it. Perfect next topic, right? Which is history. Migration history is a thing, and we're talking about a certain case of it, which is what do you do when it's not something you can continue to use? How do you keep that history? But let's broaden this out a little bit. What about history, Michael? What's challenging about it? Just standard migrations, and how does it get to this complex topic of usable, unusable, make a record, make a report, that kind of thing?
Yeah, so history can get quite tricky because obviously in PLM systems you tend to got things like revision history,
right?
So how you've gone through your revision history, so some systems just have like revision A, revision B, revision C. Other systems have got also kind of the iterations as well. So I've got in revision A, I went through multiple iterations before I got the one I was happy with, and I released that. And then it kind of goes up. And so you've got the revision history. And there's sometimes some tricky choices of how to migrate them across. And we'll come back. But then you've also got things like not just the revision history, but the object history as well. Who is the one who this attribute was modified at this date by this person from this value to that value. Which like to your point, is different from revision drawing A, drawing revision A, drawing revision B. That's the record that we care about. But to your point, in the system, there's a history of who did that work, who made that change, who checked in, checked out, that kind of thing. And some systems have got it down to a really granular level. Some of them have got some to quite a high level, and then trying to migrate that across and choosing how you're going to do it can be a little bit tricky. Particularly because obviously how systems represent history and do it in different ways.
Right.
And it also comes down to kind of what is considered the useful or important information about. I mean, why are you trying to do it? What are you trying to bring across and why? So let's start with the revision history on to start with and then go from there. So in terms of revision history, some systems let you do kind of, you have got, say, revision A, B, and C. And you've got those kind of released versions. Some PLM systems let you also store kind of all the in-work revisions you had to get to that released version.
Right.
Do you want to keep all those kind of in-work revisions and migrate them across, or is it just really the important thing is to bring across the released version?
Right.
And so it's kind of, do you bring all revisions, and also, are you bringing? Do you want all your historical revisions as well? Sometimes we've done migrations where we've literally just brought across the last release version and any in-work versions that are in work going across.
Right.
And that comes down to more of a business decision about what they want to bring across.
But again, tricky techniques though, right? I mean, because you don't do that quite the same way, I expect.
No.
Okay.
No, and it's particularly when you come into things like migrating CAD. So migrating flat lists of things, going from type A, this document type, to this document type, relatively easy. CAD gets complex because you've got objects that are related to other objects.
Right.
So to open up a CAD assembly, you need its children, for instance, the sub-assemblies and parts that go into it. But in PLM, you've got multiple revisions of all those. So it's making sure you bring across for this assembly, I need to have these revisions of these parts, and that kind of spans out across the entire system. So if you're bringing across all revisions, kind of that means you can kind of build up the whole web. There's a lot of data to bring across. If you're just bringing across release revisions, then you might have some relationship mappings to say, well, actually, my in-work part I'm using, or my in-work assembly I'm using here, is actually referencing an older in-work revision of a part that has been subsequently released. Well, actually, in the migration, you really should be pointing at the released version of that part, not the in-work version. So you've got to kind of take care of those things. And
but you've also you run a risk there, though, right? And this is maybe a different topic to dig into, but you run the risk of you're changing the history of what was in the source system when you get to the target, and that can be dangerous, right?
It has got its own problems and pitfalls, because essentially you're kind of because obviously when you're doing CAD, your PLM system has got kind of a representation of the CAD inside the database. So this assembly points to these parts and all that sort of stuff, and the history that goes with it. Inside of the CAD file, it has got the same sort of internal relationships as well. It's expecting these list of parts, these IDs, that sort of stuff. And you've got to make sure that when you do a migration, that both of those two match up so that when you open up a new system, everything opens properly. You haven't got missing files and missing data. But when you're doing this sort of mapping and relationships, it can get quite quite complicated. I mean, if you had a company that just wanted to take latest revision only, kind of it's relatively, okay, that makes sense as well. Just take latest revision and any in-work revision.
Right.
Well, that latest revision of this assembly might point to, and probably will point to, older releases of parts.
Right.
But you're just bringing across the latest revision of that part.
So those old ones won't exist in your target system.
So you then your latest revision in your part assembly now points to the latest revision in assembly, which might make perfect sense, but you have altered slightly how that CAD structure works. And that can lead to different problems.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. Well, people, they're getting not what they expect to see, or the CAD system doesn't like it and it complains, or any number of problems.
All those things as well.
So I will say, given that I introduced the episode, I think, Jen, it's my responsibility to watch our time.
It is. And it's not like I wasn't watching it.
Yeah. No, fair enough. But I will say there's one other topic. Well, I just don't want to leave without touching on this, because I think we're kind of in the middle of it. And that is this idea of history and the fact that some history you need to be able to modify and change and carry forward, and other history you don't, right? So just talk about that one for a quick second, Michael.
So, I mean, what you've done in the past, it might be, if you got to ask us, what exactly do I need to know? What is important? Is it just I need to have a report or a details or some sort of way of finding out historically what it does, as it were? So you could, rather than migrating historical information as data, you could generate a report as part of the process and then migrate that and make that report part of the data that gets migrated into the new system and then associating it with it. Where you can get kind of those sorts of things get useful is things like workflows used for releases. Workflows, PLM systems all represent release processes and workflows in completely different ways.
Indeed.
Completely different ways. So trying to migrate like in-work processes from one system to another is really complex. More often than not, you're thinking about, well, actually, do I need to bring across to do that? Or do I just actually create some sort of detailed report with all the information on the source system in enough detail that we can bring that document across and use that as your historical record?
Right. Who did what step, in what order, at what time? Did they approve? Did they reject? Did it go back to whom? And what was the version they were looking at when they did it? Like, that kind of report of the activity, but not editable, not sort of reworkable in the target system, but just there for history as a record, to your point.
Yeah, exactly. And then you'd have to worry about, it lets you kind of not have to worry about trying to migrate two completely different workflow processes that are never going to really migrate in any useful way into new target systems.
Yeah.
And so that's the way we can kind of achieve that, and keeping your historical information, but not making it too complex.
So simply what was done, why was it done type.
Yeah.
So that if there's any question like, why did we do this? What? This is why. We're not doing it that way now, but this is why we did it this way in the past.
And I think it comes back to something you mentioned earlier, Michael, which is you also have to think about what will people do with that in the target system? How will they use it? If it's just search and reference, okay, great. That gives you some parameters for how you migrate. Whereas, like you mentioned earlier, if you don't think about how people are going to use it in the new system, what the new system's behaviors are, then you might miss it. You might kind of get it wrong.
Yeah.
So if you really give that some thought, then hopefully you can maybe simplify some of these things that are really difficult to migrate, that you don't need them to be live and editable.
Yep.
Just get what you need, right?
Yeah.
All right. Okay. Now, Jonathan.
Now we can stop. Now we can stop.
Okay. The hook.
Yeah, fair enough. No, it's always a good topic to dig into, and there's always more to dig into. So, I mean, I'm going to summarize in a really, really high-level way what I think we just talked about is this stuff is hard. It is challenging, and there are a number of areas you can kind of just pick whatever you think you're dealing with in PLM, what kind of product data you need. And this isn't just PLM, right? The topics we've been talking about today are going to apply to PDM, to MES, to MRP to some degree. It's going to apply to really digital product data that has a certain character and shape to it, the way it behaves. You just have to really give it a lot of thought, and you have to have some experience and practice at it to know what you're looking for and watch out for and think about that. And I think what you said earlier, Jen, is a great idea. Let's do another episode, Michael, if you're willing. Let's come back to the pitfalls, the things you have to watch out for, instead of just, we talked about a lot of good stuff today, but I think that would be a useful way to look at this also. What do you have to watch out for when you're thinking about a migration like this? So that's my high-level summary. Jen, what did I miss? I
think you did a great job. And it's one of the things that we've been talking about in a number of different ways and on a number of different podcasts is understanding the character of the data, right? Understanding, and it's not just that, it's understanding the character of the data, and it's understanding the character of your business and how those two are related. So I think it was a great summary.
Well, Michael, any parting thoughts, things that we didn't cover that we need to make sure we come back to at some point?
I'm sure you think of many things.
We'll be back.
We'll be back and do another one.
Very good. Well, thank you for being with us today, Michael. Jen, thanks for being here as well. Really appreciate the conversation. I think it was good to dig into this after the first episode on kind of process, getting into some of these technical details. And let's come back. Let's come back and talk about pitfalls, trouble spots to avoid, that kind of thing. But for now, everybody, please stay in the conversation with us. Send us your questions, send us your comments, give us some feedback. We want to keep making episodes that are relevant to you and the journey you're on thinking about digital product data. But for now, thank you for listening and stay sharp, everybody.
Stay sharp.
Thanks for being here and listening to this episode of Stay Sharp with Razorleaf. If you have any questions, just leave a comment on our post or send us an email to podcast@razorleaf.com. And if you like this podcast, please be sure to hit the like button and subscribe to our podcast on your favorite podcast platform. Until next time, stay sharp.